Imagine a world without police. No, seriously. Close your eyes. What does that world look like? Is that a world without prisons, with better school systems, with no racism? Do you long for peace and justice, safety? If so, how do we get there? How do we work with the end in mind?
I always appreciate that video so much. So thank you, Chaz. Chaz, do you want to say anything before we get started?
I am not here. I am tired and I'm just here to enjoy you all.
All right, well, please feel free to turn off your camera. So hello and welcome. It seems like we've got about 22 folks here. We are expecting some more to come through, but we want to go ahead and get started with our conversation. So first off, thank you to AJC for hosting this. They are doing excellent work in the community, and we appreciate having this platform to be able to have these deeper conversations. You may have noticed already that JP's screen freezes. That will be happening probably pretty often. I think we said every time JP wants to make a really good comment, like the screen will freeze. So hopefully we'll be able to subvert that and be able to have him in the space. But my name is Nakia Winfield. We are joined by some really excellent guests today to talk about trauma and policing. So this is the first part of a 4-part series. So this one is specifically talking about trauma and policing with domestic violence, with sexual assault, and being able to be able to figure out, like, how are we in this abusive relationship right now, right? And so the next ones that we're going to have are going to talk about trauma from the protests. We're going to have one about over-policing, chronic over-policing, and the trauma that has. And we're also going to talk about acute trauma and trauma around folks with disabilities, trans folks, queer folks, and also folks who are undocumented. So we'll have a chance to be able to, there's a lot when you think about trauma and policing, and we'll have a chance to be able to discuss some of those at a later point. Today, we're also going to be discussing a little bit about trauma of police themselves and how they come into communities having not processed the trauma that they've had for their entire careers, right? So there's just a lot to be able to discuss. We're going to start off the conversation with us talking, and then about an hour in, we'll go ahead and invite some other folks in the audience. If you feel like you have some things that you want to include or say, feel free to jump in, and we'll invite you in and ask you to turn on your camera, and you can come and discuss with us for a little bit before heading back out. JP, do you want to add anything?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
So I'm very, very excited to introduce both Phil Hopkins and Amanda Lewis, both who, if not are currently social workers, have had social work in their background. So Amanda Lewis is an amazing social justice advocate. She's a survivor advocate. She's been doing survivor justice work for as long as I've known her, and very likely before. And so hopefully she'll be able to tell us a little bit about her background. And then we've also got Phil Hopkins. Phil is really excellent for this particular conversation. He is a former police officer, also a former social worker, and is currently doing work around critical race theory and feminist studies, I believe at TSU. So if y'all want to let us know, maybe we can start with Amanda and just tell us a little bit about what you do and what makes up your lens.
Oh goodness, I'll start by saying I'm always and forever a social worker, whatever kind of role I'm in, social work all the way. And I wear a lot of different hats in the survivor advocacy space. So I'm one of the co-founders of Survivor Justice Project. I work for the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. I've partnered with AJC on a number of kind of intersectional initiatives, one of them Searchlight Series, which I might get to a little bit later. And on the Commission for Women also advocate for a lot of survivor experience policies. So I am been in the field for about 10 years. actually more than that. And my lens is really, I would like to say, just a more of a Black intersectional, Black feminist perspective. I'm always growing and learning in that perspective. And I really look to the leadership of women of color, Black women in the community that have come before me, and Angela Davis, like Audrey, there's just so many Black feminists that I try to follow. Not there yet, learning, but I definitely kind of look to them for understanding and inspiration, as well as just, as a survivor advocate, really listening to people, listening to women. You don't get to ending violence without truth telling and naming what's going on in communities. So that's me.
Awesome.
Thank you. Phil, do you want to tell the folks watching a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing?
Sure. So, I was a social worker for a couple of years. I was working on a BSW at the time, and then I started in Child Protective Services and burned out and went back to school. And then after college, I was recruited and joined a police force. I worked for 3 different police departments for about 6 years and burned out. And now I'm an academic. I'm a philosopher, and I study critical race theory. I teach critical race theory. I work on and teach philosophy of identity primarily, including sort of racialized and gendered identities, and the way that those identity construction intersects, right, in our consumerist capitalist world with all kinds of forces that are working to configure and pre-configure identities for us. And I look at the way that impacts, our possibilities for being in the world, and the ways we question, and the things that even sort of occur to us to be questioned. And so my lens on this kind of work is deeply informed by my personal experiences. I'm a big advocate of looking for wisdom in your lived experiences, right? That's why I think that a lot of people have a lot of things to say that don't necessarily have the credentials, right, to speak a kind of authority, and so they don't get listened to, but mostly what they have to say is more valuable than what you often hear from the people who do have credentials and who study these things in a kind of abstract way. And so I'm happy to be part of the conversation today. I'll talk about my own experiences, but I'm here as much to learn from people who have a lot of wisdom as I am to say something.
Awesome, thank you. JP, should we introduce ourselves? I forget that everybody doesn't just know who we are and what we do. Do you want to say a little bit about your role?
Sure. I'm a local troublemaker is my official title, if I could choose. I'm a community organizer with the Austin Justice Coalition. Name is João Paulo. I come from Brazil. I hail from Brazil. Everyone here knows me as JP. I primarily focus on housing and community development and gentrification and how these things kind of intersect. And I also joined AJC from the very beginning because I was interested in, the question of policing. I'm an abolitionist. I kind of hope that we can move towards a world without police, and sort of that's kind of the world that I dream of. And so, I work with AJC, have been kind of doing all kinds of things lately. This has been a busy time, and I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. As I said before, my name is Nakia Winfield. I do a lot of things. Mostly I look at power dynamics and social systems using an interdisciplinary lens. So I've been in HR and tech. I've done policy analysis. I've done policy advocacy. And right now what I mostly do is racial justice. I'm doing a little bit of racial healing justice, but also just doing anti-racist workshops for organizations. I've been I've been a resource trainer with the People's Institute, so that means that I've gotten to go through a lot of the undoing racism trainings that have happened at the city, that the city have put on. And so I think I've been through every single undoing racism training that all of the APD commanders have gone through. As I've said in previous Zooms, I have been on 4 ride-alongs. I've gone to the Citizen Police Academy. I've gone to their use of force propaganda experience, to be real. And all of this has kind of colored my lens and how I view police and policing. I was also the person who facilitated the first pilot of getting APD through the equity tool for the first 7 divisions. So that is the lens that I've got right now. But I just want to get started with the conversation. So like, when you think of trauma and policing and that intersection, what are the things that what are you thinking of? Like, what comes up for you, and what are the components that make up your thought process around that? Do I want to start with Amanda again? Okay, we can.
Oh man, I mean, I think that because of my work and kind of how I have interacted with law enforcement, I tend to just want to start with just the challenges that people reporting or wanting to find a solution to violence. How surprising it is for a lot of folks that engage with the system, that the system really isn't set up to address their trauma, to help them heal, to defend their rights as victims and survivors. It really isn't. And I think there is a term that I've been really, really thinking about, which is like institutional betrayal. And kind of the experience that people have when they expect help and they expect support, they expect safety, and then their institutions. I mean, primarily, of course, we're talking about policing, but really any institution could be your church or family. But the response that, deepens the harm and not even just doesn't address it, which is horrible, but deepens and adds to it. I think when I think about trauma, is this overwhelming your system, right? Your nervous system, your coping skills, and taking away power, right? And for a system to add to that, that makes healing even more challenging, because you're still kind of in that space of fear. And so, I think that's my first thought, is just the expectations that people have around the system. And I think there's so much in popular culture that tells people, but I think for like black and brown people, there is kind of this, no, thank you, not subscribing to police. But I think for other folks, there is this just constant bombardment of police propaganda and messaging. And I think about like Law and Order SVU, that like every case is heard and there's the DA and here's the, I think there's a lot of misinformation that people have about what police can and can't do when it comes to addressing trauma. So that's my first kind of thought. I have a lot more, but just to kick it off.
Awesome, thank you. Let's mix it up. JP, tell us about what comes up for you.
Well, I think to answer the question about policing and trauma, first I would have to answer the question about trauma. When I think of trauma on a deeply personal level, I think of a kind of a little bit of an internal toughness that I associate with sort of being through moments and telling myself that I have to figure out how to get through those moments, and what emerges from that is an internal survival mechanism, a set of survival mechanisms with regards to how to navigate the world. And so I feel like those survival mechanisms in many ways have kind of dictated choices in my life. And so that's another thing I associate with trauma, which is discipline. a kind of learning of one's limits, where one can and can't go, what you can get away with in society, and what you're even just kind of allowed to think. And that's where I really think that policing and trauma comes in. I've been a witness of police violence on a number of occasions, and also a victim of police violence, primarily in Brazil and Latin America. And I feel like in all those instances, there's really this kind of fear that emerges that you carry with you, that teaches you to know your limits, to know where to go and where not to go, and what to say and what not to say. And I think even being able to come to a space like this and acknowledge and say, I'm an abolitionist, I want to live in a world without policing, requires facing that internal fear about what my limits are, what I can safely get away with. So I think that's what trauma and policing really means to me.
Thank you. Phil, I feel like you've had like decades to think about this question.
Yeah. Yes, I'm old. And yes, I have thought about this a lot. I kind of want to amplify a couple of things that both Amanda and Joe said. Just going off what Joe said there, right? I think it's really important to recognize a kind of broad, nonstop trauma that communities experience because they are the target of suspicion, they are the target of boundaries, right? That Joe was talking about, the limits, where not just sort of what you can get away with, but where you can go and where you can't go, or where you can go and be perceived as dangerous or suspect, and where you can go perhaps somewhere, maybe fewer places where you don't have to have that experience, but knowing that that experience waits for you, right? If you wander across some boundaries or transgress some boundaries. And I think that kind of trauma, that's not the same as the acute trauma you're going to be talking about later on. But I think that trauma has tremendous effects on your well-being, right? Your physical and emotional, mental well-being. And so I think it's really important to call that out. And then to talk a little bit about what Amanda was saying, right? The way that we build these, I'm a kind of, so critical theory likes to look at structures and systems, right? It likes to look at the way that we inhabit those. I don't look for and try to put my finger on some sort of individual attribute or flaw that people have, right? That needs to be fixed. I look for the way that systems are structured so that people have to inhabit them in particular ways that are simply gonna cause harm to them and to other people. And so we build these structures and systems, these bureaucracies that make propaganda claims to us, right? That we get these narratives. And I think the power of these narratives, right, really, we need to pay attention to that. We've had 2 decades now of popular media stories about who police are and what they do and how they work. And I think those stories have a big impact on police officers, right? I think police officers start thinking in terms of those narratives, and it impacts what they think they can do and what they wind up doing with people. And so I think those narratives and those systems tell a certain story that is inevitably going to be false. And when we find out that it's false, yes, that's a kind of trauma. And I guess the thing I would add to that is that police systems are structured worse, I think, than most of those institutions, because the police are structured in a way, I mean, the badge, the uniform, the gun, those are paramilitary for a reason, right? They are intended to dehumanize. They are intended to sort of make those representatives of state authority simply that, right? Tools and instruments of the state, not actual people. And so that's kind of traumatic as well for the officer to have to interact in a world behind that embodied construction. And if they want to do something right, if they want to help, I always say they kind of have to step outside of that. They have to deconstruct that and try to find a way to be something other than the thing that they are explicitly constructed to be. And so that's why I think that the kinds of harms and traumas that these systems produce are not going to be regulated, right, by the kinds of efforts that we've been doing for over a decade now, right? accountability efforts and anti-racist trainings, right? I think everybody needs to do mini anti-racist trainings, but I don't think that that's going to solve the problem with policing, because these harms and traumas are not collateral to policing. They are inherent in policing. They are inherent to the way it is constructed.
Yeah, those are very, very strong. And so those words ring really true with me, because when I think of trauma and policing, I'm like every single police encounter, right? When I think of trauma and policing, I think of community policing. And it's really strange because I think that there's a lot of folks who think of community policing as like, this is great. And I was like, you are traumatizing kids and sacrificing them to go so that these police officers, these individual police officers, can possibly see their humanity, right? Like you're going, oh, these people are dangerous and have no accountability. Let's bring them to our neighborhoods. Let's like give them our children so that they can play basketball with, right? And I think that it gets kids who are like, oh yeah, these cops are great. Like, you know, cops are really nice. And then they think later on in a different shift that this other police officer that's never met them before is going to treat them with humanity or respect or give them the benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that they are Black people existing in the world. And then all of a sudden it's a surprise because like we were told that cops were good and they came and played with our neighborhood. And I thought that I did everything right here. And I think it sets people up, it sets kids up for a lose-lose situation. And it makes it so that they are not able to protect themselves and have the information that they need to navigate the world. But also when I think of trauma and policing, like I can't get away from the idea that like, this is deeply affecting me, right? Like there's all this kind of intellectual, like, yes, it's this and yes, it's that. And I can definitely do that and hear that and have those conversations. But I feel like for me, like the feeling that I can't call the police, right? Because I don't know if they're going to show up and shoot me and I'm not willing to take that chance, right? I've seen it happen too many times. I've heard people who've had it happen. I've seen it on video, right? And even if they don't shoot and kill me, like having somebody come out, show up and let me know that I deserve like whatever happened to me is not a feeling that I'm interested in having either. And I think that there's also this idea of like, there's the trauma that happens acutely. And I think, Amanda, you spoke on this, right? Like there's the trauma that happened for somebody coming in and violating your house, but then there's the additional trauma that happens that is like your community response to that. And that community response starts with policing and whether you deserve to have justice for your case, right? And the acute response is something that like our brains are like, okay, we're going to figure out how to not have that anymore. Like an acute thing is something that happens here once and you can have a reasonable expectation that that you can avoid that, right? It's kind of like getting hit with a truck. Like, okay, but I'm going to stay out of the roadways. I'm not going to travel on I-35 anymore. And that might be inconvenient, but I'm less likely to get hit by a truck, but if I'm in a schoolyard, right? But when you're talking about like, hey, violence can happen to you. And like, we're going to assume that that's cool. Like, we're going to just assume that that's totally fine, or that you don't deserve to be able to have justice, or you can have justice if you're really nice to us. But if you're mean to us, then like, you don't get to have any, right? And so there's no accountability there. And I mean, even to the point where I'm like, people are like, oh, well, you know, like most cops are good. I'm like, if there's a cop that's trying to assault me, if there's a cop that's trying to kill me, what do I get to do? Like, how do I get to respond to that? Like, do I get to defend myself? Right? Like the answer is no, right? The answer is stop resisting. And so like any steps that I take to defend myself are criminal because of who I'm doing them against, regardless of what the situation is. And if whatever happens and they're like, oh, she accidentally was innocent. Like, oh, that's really terrible, right? But there's not anything that I can do to protect myself in the minute. And I think that that's such a brain fuck, right? Oh, y'all, we swear here, sorry. Didn't give a warning, but like, that is such a mind fuck when you're like, oh, this person can do anything that they want to me in front of other people, right? Up to the point where they can literally kill me on the sidewalk and I don't have any options to fight back. Like all I can do is like be as placating as possible. And like, how is it to feel like, how does it feel knowing that like when you walk by a cop and they're like, get on the ground, get down on the ground right now, right? And even if nothing else happens, like that's still humiliating, right? Like there's still a debasement there. There's still a way in which like you move through the world lesser, right? And knowing that that's there and that's a possibility especially by people who like I pay, like my money goes to like doing these things, and instead of like helping people, my money is used to like kind of harass folks on some level. I feel like that's a lot of the trauma for me. That's where that comes up for me. But I kind of want to open it. Like we've said a lot so far. What are your thoughts about the conversation that we've had, or anything that anybody said?
Nakia, I wanted to jump in with a question for Phil, but also a question for everybody, which is, you talked about sort of the broad trauma that we kind of just live in our everyday lives, just kind of everywhere. It's the structural trauma that we experience. And just thinking about that kind of trauma, I think that touches on one of the reasons why I even kind of had sort of an internal dialogue, kind of a trouble with the very concept of trauma. Because for me, trauma on some level implies something that can be healed, or something that can be treated, or something that can be made better. But when we're talking about this kind of broad trauma that just is kind of the ether, it's the air I breathe, it's the institutions, it's kind of the reality in which I'm inserted, then that becomes a question for me about, well, how even to treat, or other than to just do the kind of dismantling of these of this world, and and so like I just think about that. I was wondering if you could sort of speak a little bit more to that tension between, and one last thing I wanted to add on that is just the sense that like that level of trauma that's so pervasive, it's not even recognized as trauma. We don't even think of it. We don't even identify it. And for us, it's just like, that's just reality. That's just what's normal. That's just the way things are. And I think about the way we mentioned this in a previous webinar. We did a survey in Colony Park where we talked to many different people in the neighborhood about policing, and people that took the survey told us that they thought they were likely to be victims of discrimination, racial discrimination by police officers. They had a real kind of mixed bag. On the one hand, they had bad experiences with police officers. A lot of them had family members who had been arrested and so on. And yet at the same time, they wanted more police in their neighborhoods. They kind of wanted that. And so just thinking about the way in which, I don't even begin to identify this as a problem, because it's just life. It's just the way life is. That's how I've been taught that things are. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of prod you on that a little bit, see if you'd be interested in saying more.
Yeah, I can start, but others may have some things to say about that as well. So I think I'll recommend a person that talks about this a lot that I borrow from, because she's a really good thinker, by the name of Linda Alcoff. And she has a book called Visible Identities that's really good. I highly recommend it. And one of the points that she makes that I think is really important in response to what you're saying is that we can think of things as sort of having become reality or being normal without, the word she uses is naturalizing them, right? Without thinking that they're inevitable, without thinking that they have to be that way, that it's just somehow built into the nature of the world or the nature of people or the nature of things or something like that. And I'm someone who thinks that where we're at right now got built, right? It got built one step at a time. There are a lot of good sources out there about the history, right, of the invention of these kinds of racialized identities, right? I mean, they weren't always around. They're not natural. They're not inevitable, right? And so how did they get built is an important question to understand. But the very fact that they got built suggests to me that something else can be built. I mean, I think that I'm a big believer in novelty, in creation, in the idea that it's not all fixed and it's not all set. And I know that sounds kind of esoteric, but I mean that in concrete ways in my lived life, right? I mean, I don't think that I have to parent the way I was parented, right? I don't think that I have to interact with people the way people have interacted with me or are interacting with me right now, right? I think that we have agency. And one of the ways that we maximize our agency is to use a phrase that the People's Institute likes to use a lot. The way we maximize agency is by maximizing clarity. We have to see things clearly. And then we open up possibilities for disrupting our habits of perception and disrupting our embodied habits of behavior and paying attention to the fact that we have habits that we perceive in particular ways because people around us perceive that way and we have perceived that way. But they are perceptions and we can redirect them, right? I mean, so that's how I think about it. But then I have to admit that I have a lot of freedom, right? My boundaries don't crowd up against me in the way a lot of other people's boundaries do, right? And so my reality is maybe a kind of a reality that encourages me to think about my agency, right? And to try to grab a hold of my agency. And so I want to recognize that as well. At the same time, I want to say that I really resist the idea that these structures are inevitable.
Whew. I was just thinking that that was such a good question. I mean, both of y'all had really good thoughts and questions that I feel. I think it's interesting. I'm not surprised that when surveyed, people said, you know, these people hurt me, but I'm gonna call, you know, I wish there were more. Like, that doesn't surprise me because I feel like there's not options, or at least people don't perceive there to be options, right? Nobody's like, hey, do you want more jobs or better schools? No, they're like, here, we have more money for police. Do you want those? You know, and I think that the imagination that we have around what can change is really stifled in crisis. And I think when you're in crisis, and some people will say it's like little t crisis, where this kind of, you know, being unsafe in your home, being unsafe in your community, and kind of this death by 1,000 cuts that a lot of communities experience, you know, that the answer is so tough because you don't get the clarity of being without fear to just really think and explore. That is a factor of trauma and crisis, right? And so, you know, I think the situations that people are in are going to drive their choices and experiences and their perspectives. It's not just about the history. I mean, it is about history, of course, but not just about that or opportunities. It is about, you know, the situations. And I was just thinking while you were talking, Nakia, about, I just finished reading some fiction. I don't know if y'all have read Kindred. Didn't feel like fiction. Y'all are like, whoo, Octavia E. Butler, whoo. She really, for those of you who haven't read it, she's basically this Black woman that, it's kind of like Outlander, if anybody has watched that, where she goes from the 1970s to like 1817. Oh, good. So y'all read it in the book club. And it's just really hard. It's a hard read, but I could not put it down. But that fear that you talked about, like, if these people find me, or if they, you know, want to hurt me, there's nothing I can do. And there's just this kind of, it's so much of what I think about police. And it's, and that is, and I think about the history of policing and how there's that tie. And I'm just like, yeah, how do you heal in that context? And for me in our work, right, so we're talking about people healing from layers of trauma, right? So you've recently been assaulted or raped, plus you don't feel safe in your home, plus you're dealing with institutional issues. And, if you're trans, if you're non-binary, there's other layers, disabilities, other layers. And we tend to put money into the same type of healing buckets. Like you get some therapy, you get groups. And I think what we're learning is that people that feel so disconnected from their culture and their community, people that aren't able to deal with their historical trauma in community, you don't get access to that healing, because a lot of the healing is trying to get you to feel safe in your body. And if you're not safe, then now we're trying to trick our minds. So, there is this viewing of healing, I think that's really culturally grounded in different practices, indigenous practices, that is about kind of collective healing, reconnecting the spirit, and healing in addressing institutional issues as well. Because you're right, like, how do you heal when you're constantly being re-traumatized, right? If we were, your doctor would be like, if your leg hurts when you move it like that, don't move it like that. But you can't, do that when we're talking about this institutional kind of consistent trauma. So, I feel like that's the hard question, but I think that's so key to liberation for our communities, is this healing piece. But, it's how do you do that at the same time when it's just a constant triggering? So
Yeah.
I wish I had more answers.
Sure. I think, Amanda, you said the amazing phrase institutional betrayal earlier. And I wrote that down because I was like, yes, that's exactly what happens, right? And I think that institutional betrayal, we all wrote it down, is kind of what happens to the folks in the survey that JP was talking about, right? Like, there's the police that we come in contact with, but then there's the police that we see on TV, right? And like we said before, like the stories in which we understand police to be, like, we're like, oh, well, we just got the wrong ones. We want the other ones. We want the good police, the SVU police. Where do I get that guy, right? Like, where do we get Matlock? Well, he's a lawyer, but like, where do we get the Andy Griffith police, right? Like, where are the good ones that are patrolling those other neighborhoods, right? And I feel like you can even see that, and I'll just touch on this really quickly because we're going to do the one about protests and over policing at a different point. But like, even when we're talking about defunding the police, people who have been out in the protests, who see like exactly what's going on, or who have watched the videos where they're like, oh my gosh, I've just discovered that the police are bad. This is terrible. But like, I don't want to defund them. Who will I call when I need help, right? As though those are different police officers that are going to be coming to your door. Like, it's not the ones that like, snipe these people or like push reporters into fires or like any of the bad police. Like, those are just the riot police. But the good police are going to come when like you need them and when you're called, right? And I think that there's this really large kind of disconnect there. And I think about that when I think about trauma, and the fact that like the folks who are being over policed right now, and who are like, yes, we want more police in our neighborhoods, there's a certain amount of gaslighting, right? That we're like, this is what we're told on TV. This is the acceptable narrative. Everybody's okay with that narrative. And we're experiencing something different, but we know that we can't rely on our own experiences, right? Like, nobody believes our experiences. And so why would this be different? So like, not only do y'all not believe our experiences, but like, we're told that we can't believe our experiences or even express them, right? And so of course there's this like, oh, well, we just got the wrong police. Like, that was a one-off, even though we know on a bodily level, right, that like, this is not true. But like, on a words level, on a cognitive level, we know that if we say that we want more policing, that we get rewarded for that, right? By certain people. They're happy when we say that. If we're like, nah, fuck the police, like, we get put in the bad bucket, right? And like, we don't get to deserve any sort of justice at that point, right? Even accidental justice. And so I think that there's a certain amount, like, there's another kind of distancing, like, mindfuck of like, oh, my mouth is saying this thing, and cognitively, like, I have to have this thought process, but my entire body is telling me that this is absolutely not okay and this is not true. And like, the feeling of like saying one thing and having your body know another thing is itself like a trauma response.
can I just add real quick? And I'm super like, I don't know, I'm like a social worker, I'm super sensitive. And I've been thinking about just this, this thing that I'm trying to process around making sure that I don't shame people, especially survivors and victims, by kind of, and I don't think this is happening here at all, but just a thought, and I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts that, especially when we talk about criminal justice reform, I never want to make the comment that people calling the police is, the harm. I think, Karen at the park, yes, using the police as a weapon. But I think that people in crisis that really don't feel like they have options and are doing something to save their life. I think it's so important that we put that, put the attention on the people causing harm and the systems causing harm. So, because I used to always say, like, as long as there's people calling police, we're going to need to know what they're about and what they're doing, and we need to check and, but I think, I don't know, I've been like in this transition where it's like, as long as people rape and abuse other people and those people do what they have to do, we're going to have to understand those options. You know what I mean? So I kind of am in this transition of making sure that we acknowledge the harm and where it's coming from. Because I do feel like there's a lot of weight put on people that need help to address the institutional betrayal or the harm that's coming out of the system, when I feel like they're really trying to get some healing for themselves. And I think that a lot of women, especially women of color, feel very keenly that balance or that kind of concern, right? Like I feel like this person's gonna kill me. 911, I'm gonna call 911, but am I gonna harm my community by trying to get help? Am I, so at that point you're choosing between your safety in the moment and the safety of your community. And I think that's a horrible burden to put on someone trying to do what they can to survive. And so that kind of concept is from, and I know this was a part of the book club. I think it was Arrested Justice.
Yeah, Beth Ritchie.
Yeah, Arrested Justice. Yeah, Beth Ritchie talks about the trap of loyalty and that kind of concept that, we're fighting against this desire to be safe in the moment and the reality that this is a system that hurts our communities. And so as long as survivors are silenced, that harm compounds. And so it makes it even less safe for especially women of color within communities, because you're not going to be heard and people are looking at the system's harm over the harm that you're experiencing. So that's just something I've been thinking a lot about. I couldn't make it shorter, but anyway. Yeah.
No, this is great.
That was very thought-provoking and very important, I think. And I want to hear that, but I kind of want to put it in conversation with something I heard Nakia saying as well, right? That I really want to hear that plea really that you offered, not to put that kind of burden on people who feel like they need help, right? They need that kind of help. They need some intervention. They are in crisis, they are in danger, they are under threat, and they need that kind of intervention. And so you want the good cops to show up that Nakia was talking about, right? The ones that are there to help and the ones that are going to be able to stop it and fix it. And I guess I want to say, and here's where I'm perhaps going to sound a bit more like Joe earlier, right? Perhaps a little pessimistic. And I'm speaking from my own experience and my own training. And it's been a number of years ago now. But to be honest, I think it may be worse than when I was actually a cop. I really resist this idea of thinking in terms of good cops and bad cops, right? I mean, there are bad cops. People are attracted to the job for bad reasons, people that shouldn't be in that job, right? People are attracted to the authority and the power, and they shouldn't be in that job. But we're not going to fix policing by fixing our recruiting systems and just figuring out how to get those cops out of there, because being a cop is itself problematic, right? I mean, there's a reason that they do the effectively, you know, the ones that show up at the protests are the ones being what cops are trained and constructed to be. Cops are trained and structured to control and to segregate, to protect certain communities at the harm, you know, at the risk and at the cost of other communities. That's what they're equipped to do. And so the sad reality is when they're called upon to do anything better than that, right? And at least half the time, they're called upon to be social workers, just to be sort of, to put it under that big umbrella. And they are not equipped or trained to be social workers. And even when they're sort of trained to intervene and protect, the reality is mostly they're just going to show up after the damage has been done. Mm-hmm. And they're going to have to witness it the same as everybody else. And that's traumatic. Let me speak personally about that. It was traumatic for me to keep showing up after the damage was done, right? And wanting to have been there just a little bit earlier to try to have fixed it and not being able to. Mostly cops do not solve crimes. You know, I don't care what these TV shows say. Mostly they do not prevent crimes, right? They're there to control and segregate. That's what they're trained to do. That's what they're equipped to do. The cops that show up after the fact that actually have a chance to give people some justice, right? Those are the criminal investigation division cops. Those are not the guys in the uniform that you're constantly interacting with, right? Those are the guys that show up later. We don't have very many of them in any police department, right? And the sad thing is being a patrol cop, being a uniform cop, doesn't really train you or equip you to become one of them, right? And so if we were going to think about refunding the police, but keeping some funds in police, what I would argue is let's reconstruct the police so that they're largely criminal investigation sort of agents, not people in uniform patrolling the streets, policing and over-policing the streets, because those people are really just trained to act in ways that are mostly going to make the situation worse.
And, you know, jumping on that bandwagon, I was thinking a lot about you talked about the sort of the core role, the core mission of policing, which I really understand to be sort of the control and administration of the state's monopoly over violence, and really kind of making sure that that there's this one kind of dominant source of violence on that level. But then thinking a lot about how there are certain kinds of violence that are perceived to be threats to the established order or to the status quo. You know, maybe a bank robbery or a rioter throwing a brick through a window or someone lifting a snack off a grocery store shelf, or I don't know, certain kinds of violence that are perceived as threats. And then there are kinds of violence that maybe aren't really threats to the established order at all. They work almost to reinforce the established order. And I think a lot about how the way violence against women particularly works very much in favor of maintaining the established order the way things are. So that in a sense, police officers really don't have a mandate to prevent violence against women, because violence against women does not threaten the state. It does not threaten sort of what is in place of what police officers are trying to preserve. So just thinking about that, I just kind of want to throw that out to everyone, see what y'all think about that. But that's really something that I think about a lot, just the way in which, you know, there's this certain violences that threaten the state, but then there are violences that work in favor of the status quo. And I think a lot about an author who I think is very interesting, Steve Martineau, who does this book called The Machinery of Whiteness, where he tries to get into the history of whiteness. And one of the things that he said that stood out to me is this idea that in order to maintain the concept of racial purity, in order to maintain a society based on racial purity, control over women's bodies is absolutely essential. You have to control women's bodies if you're going to maintain this kind of race-based society. So, you know, a husband coming home beating his wife, or, you know, male partner, you know, engaging in sexual violence of some sort, that is very much part of the program in a sense. But anyway, just throwing that out there. I want to see what y'all think.
Oh man, yeah, I think that's, I think if police are really here to uphold white supremacy and capitalism and sexism, and uphold our norms, I think a norm is that women need to be controlled. So I'd absolutely think that's behind a lot of just the reinforcing of trauma for people experiencing the system. And I think that it's try to defend it because I think the numbers really speak for themselves. I think for sexual assault, we have maybe 9% report, and then maybe 2% prosecutions around sexual assault. So you have people on the front end that don't have faith in the system, and then it's confirmed by people that go through the system. And so, you know, you think about people that they know sharing those experiences, or if you're assaulted again, you know, are you going to go through that experience again? So, you know, I think that there is so much evidence that that's the case. And it's interesting because in my work, I have a lot of interactions with, you know, good people that really don't have a sense of this institution that's really upholding all these other terrible institutions, right? That just whoever is left over by capitalism, they just, you know, the police kind of scoops up. And I think that there is, I don't know, I feel like it's even challenging in my field, and almost like wanting to be like, oh, but you're good, and, you know, I respect you. But also being like, well, look at these outcomes, you know, look at what we're seeing, look at who we're throwing away. You know, and I think there's also just like largely in how the help seeking space, when you're not challenging these systems, you end up getting all this money to solve problems that keep getting worse every year. And we keep getting all this money. The police keep getting it, nonprofits keep getting it. You know, I think that it really stifles us from thinking about really bigger, imaginative solutions, right? So, you know, when I think about like, okay, I don't want survivors to be blamed for the issues of the system, but we need options, right? Like, what are the options out there? Because the reality is, if you're one option and you're terrible, you know, our field is really good at choosing between bad and worse options. Like, okay, that's less bad, let's do it. Because what else do you have? So, you know, I think a lot of just how I see things is like, you know, people do what they need to do to survive. And if we don't create other opportunities, we're just going to be into, I think, making other systems that look a lot like the ones that we have too, you know? So, you know, and that's also a concern. It's just like, if we're not creative, if we don't build and create, like what is going to pop up in its place? Is it going to be worse? Anyway.
I feel like there's been so much richness to be able to respond to. And like, there's so much. I think that, Amanda, when you were talking about like putting the blame on folks who call the police, like the fact that we're putting folks in this position anyway is also like a source of trauma, right? Like, these people are like, oh, am I gonna get to live today? Or am I gonna have to betray my community, right? Like, that's just trauma. And I feel like there's trauma in every single part of policing, like every single thing that it touches. Like Phil, when you were talking about that you were traumatized because you got there late, right? And I'm also thinking about the fact that police don't process trauma. Like, right, drinking isn't an acceptable coping mechanism that's going to make this better, right? And when we have cops who are out here who are trained, like you said, to control things, and they haven't processed trauma, and so like people in these communities are not able, like they have to de-escalate, right? Because these cops are coming in at 37 out of 10, right? Because there's not a cop that you're not getting them on their first day unless it is their first day, because like there's all this kind of cumulative trauma because they just saw a domestic violence incident that they were too late for, right? Or they just saw like an accident on the highway and like body parts, right, of like little kids or whatever, and there's not a way to be able to kind of clean that slate, right? Like it just kind of builds and it compiles, and then it kind of like you get desensitized and you separate from yourself, right? But that means that you're separating from yourself and like not being as human as you need to be, which means that you show up in these places and you're not able to be human and you're not able to connect to your humanity. You're certainly not able to see the humanity of somebody who looks completely different, who you've been told all your life is like somebody who's naturally a criminal, right? Like who in the training videos, like even though Black people make up what 7% of the population in Austin, but like they make up 50% of the perpetrators in the videos that you're using to be able to train to do your job, right? And like how is that cumulative trauma gonna be manifesting itself when you see this person who doesn't look like you, who you're told is bad, and you're supposed to be showing up to help them, and you're like, no, that person's probably the one that did it, right? You know? And so those are some of the things I think about. And then there's also like, so I went on a ride along, and I went on this ride along, and we showed up to the there's a workers, I forget, it's like a workers assistance program. It's for like when you have unemployment. It's over an airport. We showed up, and there was somebody who was upset and had flipped over a table in like this workers whatever, and they called the cops on him. And he's outside and he's talking when we get there, and he's telling the officers that he was at the food stamp place, and they told him that he had to come over here to get something, some piece of paper or something that they needed in order to go back over there and get food stamps and get his food for the week or for however long. And so because it's so late, this is like 4:30 right now, he's been on the bus for hours, has not had anything to drink for 6 hours, has not had anything to eat for longer than that, shows up and they tell him, oh no, like this is incorrect, like you can't do this is the wrong information. And so like he throws the table over, and then like the cops talk to him, they let him know you can't flip tables, that's not okay. And then eventually like he gets him back on the bus, right? It's 4:30, he can't get to any institution that's going to be able to help him like get his food at this point, right? Like it's just a complete waste of your day. And the way in which the police officers are employed is that like they're employed to let you know that you can't flip over a table, but it's okay to starve you, right? Like it is okay. Like they are reinforcing that status quo, right? Because like the status quo, like harming women is definitely the status quo, right? But it's definitely founded on like harming and eliminating Black folks, right? Black and brown folks, if we want to get technical, but definitely Black people, right? Trans folks, people with disabilities, right? And so like this, I think that there's a way in which they show up and they reinforce societal oppression that is already traumatic, and they let you know that you're going to meet state-sanctioned violence if you do not comply with this already traumatic thing. And so I feel like they're an exaggerator, right? Like they show up and they're able to go like, oh, hey, by the way, nobody cares about you, and if you try to act out about it, like we're going to put you in jail and make it even worse for you. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, can I build on, that's an excellent observation you made there, Nakia, that I just don't hear people talking about enough. The way in, like it seemed to me when I was a cop and I went through the training, then you go out on the street and you get the job training, right? The on the street training. It seemed to me like the primary skill that I was required to learn on the street was indifference. I went into police work thinking, okay, I'm going to hold on to my humanity, right? I'm going to treat people the way I would want to be treated. That didn't last very long, right? I mean, it is a traumatic job. You're always bad news. When people call you and want you there, it's because something really bad just happened, right? And if they didn't call you and they don't want you there, then they really don't want you there, and you're bad news. You're never not bad news. And you go and you see bad stuff over and over again. And the thing that you train yourself to do is not let it get to you. And then pretty soon, you're not letting your domestic partner get to you. You're not letting your family get to you. You're not letting anything get to you. And those are the people that show up and respond to the call. The people who have trained themselves not to let anything get to them. And that is going to have an impact. That is going to create trauma and harm in that interaction, right?
Yes, thank you. I feel like it's 7 o'clock. We haven't had a ton of questions, and we are totally welcome to keep discussing, but I was going to invite a person on. I don't know, what do y'all think?
Yeah, and also to all participants on the call right now, if you do have questions, don't be afraid to ask. Don't hesitate to join in, participate, add your thoughts. But yeah, go for it.
I feel like Teo Castro was saying some good stuff a little bit earlier about complex trauma over long periods of time. Do you want to raise your hand and come on? Is Teo even still there? Teo is still there. Oh, did you promote them for panelist?
Hey, am I on cam? I'm not sure.
You can be on camera if you want to turn your camera on.
Here, you are promoted to panelist.
Oh. You're back.
Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
Did you want to tell us a little bit about the comment that you made earlier and expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I've never really had a reason to call the cops. I think I called them once in Hayes County about some dude that was harassing us. And the Hayes County cop came over and he came and asked us some questions. And then he went over to the guy's house who was, we were teenagers, 18. And he went over to the guy's house who was 7 years older than us, asked him questions. And apparently that guy said there's he made it seem like there wasn't an issue. And then the cop came back, and because I assume, I don't know, maybe we seemed like sketchy teenagers, but he basically dismissed us and was no help at all. So that was the worst experience I had with a cop, and it made me not want to call them. But when I thought about APD, I was I've had some situations where they interacted with me, and I was like, oh, you know what? APD is actually pretty good, because when I did what I was supposed to do, I had my hands up, or I didn't move, I followed instructions, they were nice and they treated me like a human being. But when I thought about it later, if my standard for what a good cop is just based on the fact that when they're in my presence, I didn't die or get hurt, I don't even think of them as an option for making things better. And that was so normalized to me that I tried to focus on other things, but it wasn't really until the protests started, because I've been kind of writing about police abolition and how this wasn't a good solution for a couple of years, but it wasn't until I saw other people starting to agree this year and say, yeah, this isn't okay. It's not okay to have to think in this abstract term of almost Stalin-esque, or the way that the thing that people associate with Stalin, where he's one is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic. This happens to all kinds of marginalized people, and especially people that lie at intersections of things. I'm queer, and I've had issues with mental health, and brown, and live in the East Side. So it might be that people who have various forms of institutional privilege get by just enough so that they don't actually see this stuff. But if you lie at the intersection of a bunch of different things that are marginalized, you get to see it all the time. And even though it's just a bunch of different instances of indifference that leads to this level of isolation that nobody is on your side. And until other people start to see it and agree with it, it's not only dehumanizing, but it's like crazy making, because you're like, why can't anyone else see this? Am I the only one who has a problem? So that's my thought, I guess. Just that even though nothing, like a cop never shot me or put a gun to my head, but they pointed a gun at me, and I wasn't able to really feel like injustice was done until other people were saying, oh yeah, actually that is traumatic. That's what I got.
No, thank you so much for sharing with us. Y'all look like you got some things to say. No?
I have a few things to say. One of the things I wanted to say is I'm really interested in what you said, Teo, about how it's crazy making, because I think that's gaslighting, and that's also this kind of the way that abusive relationships work. Is they're crazy making, right? They not only do they make you crazy, they create this concept of crazy to delegitimize your experience, and then you become ignorable, right? So I'm really interested in that concept, and also even I've been reading a lot about the Black Panthers lately, and just the way in which they were sort of institutionally, like they were completely surveilled, infiltrated, just monitored at all times, as a community organization, and how so many of them had to deal with several layers of paranoia, and how that kind of paranoia becomes normal for people in the community who try to speak up or try to say anything about policing.
Oh no.
Every time.
It happened. I froze.
Yeah.
Happy back. Okay.
Do you want to try again?
No, I don't know how much I lost. Clearly the internet is conspiring against me. I'm not. No, but I was just saying that I'm really interested in this idea of the paranoia that emerges from trying to speak up, from trying to do anything about it, and the way that activists, community organizers have been systematically monitored, surveilled, infiltrated, and so on and so forth. But not only activists, right? I mean, you're constantly being watched, if you're in an over-policed community and all of that. So anyway, those are things that really stood out to me. I don't have like a sort of something brilliant to offer you, but I just wanted to highlight those things because I think you said them beautifully, and I think they're super important.
Yeah, I don't know, that's pretty brilliant, I think. Patricia Williams, in a really good book from a while ago now, I don't know if people read it that much anymore, called The Alchemy of Race and Rights. It's really good, I recommend it. She talks about the way in which, she labels it wilderness, right? If you have perceptions that are different from the collective perceptions of the dominant power groups, right? Then your perceptions are wild, right? Your perceptions occupy a kind of wilderness. But she argues very forcefully, right, that the key to justice is crossing the borders into that wilderness, right? We have to look at, listen to those wild perceptions, right? Because if all we ever do is look at the world the way we look at the world, right, then it's, as both of you, as both Tayo and Joe were describing, right, then everything someone says is either a reinforcing of that or out of bounds and crazy, right? And so by labeling it crazy, you prevent yourself from seeing the world more fully, more richly, more clearly. And so, yeah, I think that's a very important thing, is that the key here is not just to make room for some other perceptions, right? Or to sort of add a few of those perceptions into the dominant sort of way of looking at things, right? Over there at the fringes, right? We'll make a little room for those wild perceptions over there. We have to let those perceptions disrupt and deconstruct our own. We have to seek out perceptions that refute our perceptions, and that create an opportunity for us to see freshly and see clearly. That's how I think we make progress in that way we first started talking about, Joe. When things seem normal and this is just what's real, well, we have to seek out and really listen to people who see a different real.
I think, do you want to go, Amanda?
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you, Teo, for sharing your truth, and I think that kind of trauma, that kind of that I think you mentioned the paranoia is, you know, that hypervigilance is toxic to our bodies, right? Like we're, you know, what you have to do is turn off your body's response, right? Like you have to ignore like what you're feeling. And that disconnects our bodies from our mind. And so you have a lot of people that literally cannot feel themselves because they're trying to cope and move forward. And so when we talk about that traumatic stress, you know, we have a lot of people in our communities that have PTSD. And it's not diagnosed and it's not talked about. So, you know, I think there's this just power in being able to own and recognize what happens when we live in a state of fear. You know, it really, really disrupts our body's ability to heal and us to be able to trust our bodies.
Yeah. I feel like, actually, can you pronounce your name for me? Is it Teo or Tao?
Oh, it's Tayo.
Tayo? Okay, thank you. I think that one of the things that you're explaining is that kind of status quo thing again, right? Where like, if you are having this particular experience, then like the status quo is okay with that. But as soon as like other people who are not usually thinking of themselves as on the shit end of the stick or having that experience, then it's an issue, right? And I think that that's been really prevalent and like been really clear in these last couple of months where like Black people having to deal with police brutality is a Black problem, right? But now that like we had these protests and like white people are getting hurt too, or like camera folks are getting hurt in the media, now it's a police brutality problem, right? We're having a very different conversation than we ever would have had before, because the police are like, oh, I'm just going to treat everybody like they're Black or brown, right? Or like they're undocumented. We're just going to disappear all sorts of people off the streets, regardless of what their actual documentation is. And now we're able to have that conversation, right? Or the idea of like the wall of moms, right? Like the wall of moms gets press attention when it's white, but like we've been having moms out here every day, right? Like on camera trying to get justice for their children. And those people don't get to be like, we don't get to be moms, right? Like we get to be like angry Black women, right? And so I think that this is like, I think that what you're experiencing is just like a continuation of this idea that like, it's okay for us to treat certain people this way, right? And because like the idea is that it's based in inhumanity, of course they're not going to listen to our stories. Like our stories are not believable and they're not valid or relevant, right? Like they're not the main story. They're a blip, they're a one-off, they're a specific situation wherein the issue that needs to be changed is your behavior or like your thought process. Like if you just stop thinking about it, then like it won't be so bad, right? Or like maybe you should go get therapy. And honestly, like we should all go get therapy. Like anybody who's touched the police at any point in time should get therapy. Also, everybody is like living in a pandemic. We need to be in therapy. But like the idea of therapy is like that, like y'all were saying before, is an individual like thing, right? And not we need to fix these systems. But now that it's happening to other folks, we need to fix these systems, right? And so I think that there's a really mixed feeling for me about defunding the police, because fuck yeah, defund the police, but also like, really? Now y'all want to defund the police? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. Do y'all have any other questions or anything else you want to say? JP, you playing with it?
No, I mean, I was gonna ask you, Tayo, if you feel like right now where you're at in your life, and sort of where you're at in your community, do you feel like if there was an alternative that you could call that's not the police, or the people around you that they could call, if you have any thoughts, have you given any thought to like what that alternative would look like alternative support systems? Not that you have some super detailed plan in your mind, but like if you could yearn for something that wasn't police, but that you could call to help, what would that be like for you?
Sure. Yeah, so kind of to build on, I wanted to respond to something Phil said, and then I think that'll give some good context about craziness and what crazy means to people when they say it, especially people who have never been quote unquote crazy or like gone through a mental health crisis. Because when you're a kid and someone says something that you don't understand, it's pretty much normalized that, like, especially if it's an adult that says something that you don't understand, we teach kids that that probably means that person knows about something that you don't necessarily know about. So listen. But by the time people become adults, and especially, I don't know, in my experience, once they go to college or get some kind of institutional like credit, they now, when they hear something from someone that they don't understand, they dismiss them as crazy. And I don't totally get why that happens, but I think it's pretty harmful. So if I live in a neighborhood that has gun violence, and that was my main concern. Like that was when I was a teenager, and I was one of the most vulnerable targets. Like I knew I was a vulnerable target for recruitment by all kinds of groups that might want to weaponize that vulnerability and that fear. So I, being a pretty isolated and nerdy person, kind of delved into like literature on military strategy initially. Like my heroes were people like Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan and Patton, because like those people were effective at securing their environment. And what I wanted most in that state was security. But the more I learned about it, I was finding like, okay, this violence tends to breed violence, but that doesn't mean you don't necessarily need to sometimes be forceful about how you're defending yourself. So what is this line? Is there a line between force and violence? So when I started boxing when I was 17, that was healing for me, because I finally felt like I have brought some of the safety that I was taught to rely upon into my own body, and I no longer have to call on somebody else to do that. So the more that I've learned about different kinds of threats, like gun violence and explosives, especially back in 2018, when that was like 2 blocks away from my house, I became almost like kind of a scary person, just knowing all this. And I was running through I was running through some of the same mental pathways as a lot of like hate groups. And so it was this weird situation where I was like really opposed to the violence that I felt like hate groups were bringing into my life, but I also have this psychological proximity to people like, I don't know, like hate gangs in prison, where I know that you don't like try to respond with overwhelming force unless you think you might have to respond to overwhelming force. It just from the experiences that I've had. And so feeling like I'm in a place where I can risk assess, and I can view things from their point of risk assessment and say, I know you're afraid right now, but we have the same values and we all want nobody to get hurt. I felt like that's been able to be a bridge for me, even between like me as this pretty radical left-leaning like abolitionist, across these like really extremist groups who are saying, you know, these laws and these systems don't align with our values or allow us to live out our lives. And so I do agree that we need to synthesize, not just like acknowledge, but allow the things that are true in their experience to be incorporated in a way that doesn't invalidate their experience, and respond to that legitimately, even if these are people who are violent, because they're not all violent because they're experiencing pain, but they wouldn't be as good at recruiting if they weren't experiencing pain. So my solution for me, which since the protests have started, I'm trying to gauge where everyone's wavelength is at, and I'm really I'm really not sure. So I'm slowing it down a little bit, but I'm a musician, and dance is really important to me. And martial arts and dance have a very deep connection. I've looked into capoeira and stuff. And I worked at a rec center over East 183 that was a primarily Black community. And we had, kids got in fights. They got in little fist fights or whatever. But I was like, all right, I'll teach you some things about boxing if you want to learn how to defend yourself, but only if you promise me that you're not going to hurt somebody. And it was pretty effective. They would listen to me because this security that they wanted was being provided, and they wouldn't get in fights if they really felt safe anyway, I think. So I want to do something. There's something about music and dance and ritualized combat, especially like speaking as an Indigenous person, that I think allows a spiritual connection to be made and for people to develop their bodies and build functionality, which is really important. And like security and confidence in their ability to defend themselves without enshrining it in violence. Like there are plenty of philosophies all around the world that have a philosophy around martial arts and the use of force that is against violence and that it exists to defend. Police doesn't do that. Like they're in their policy, it's like to maintain the peace, which peace is like nobody should be mad or causing too much of a ruckus, versus protecting life, which is the highest priority in my opinion. So I would like to incorporate music and dance and community into this sort of like building up our bodies and spiritually validating ourselves through saying it's okay for me to know how to defend myself. And that doesn't make me like a violent person or an angry person or anything. That's what I got.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you.
That was beautiful.
That was, yeah. I did want to just, there's something that you said, Nakia, that made me like, oh gosh, about, why we don't get responses when you see Black people dying on TV and you see kind of these examples of protesters being harmed. And, I think that part of the dehumanization is just this belief that we can take it. I think there's a lot of people that look at Black people, and I think this is true, especially for like women and women of color, that we have this fortitude that, oh, y'all can handle it, but not me. I can't do all that. But you guys, and I think that's really dehumanizing. I think it shows up in different systems in the medical field. There are studies that say that doctors think that Black and brown people can take more pain than other people and prescribe less pain medication, don't acknowledge their pain as much. And I think that happens on a community level. And I think it's something we internalize as well. That we can take it, we can, keep pushing and fighting. And, but I've just been thinking about how dehumanizing that is, like, because we have to, right? We have to survive, we have to keep pushing. But, the humanity there is lost, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's connected to something else that Nakia was saying as well. As usual, Nakia has so many brilliant things to say.
I want to thank you real quick for Teo, and I'm going to put him back in the panelist group. Thank you so much for sharing and talking with us.
Yeah, and I kind of want to echo something that Teo was saying there, right? That there's a difference between sort of the exercise of sanctioned state force on communities and the exercise of some kind of force to protect and defend yourself, right? There's a fundamental difference there. And this connects to what Amanda was saying, I think, that yes, we have this narrative that Black and brown bodies can tolerate violence better or more or something like that, right? And therefore it's more okay to exercise that violence upon those bodies, right? And that's the slave owner mindset, right? I mean, that's a way of looking at things that's been around since the invention of whiteness, right? The invention of Blackness as property. And so that's connected to the idea that, okay, you can absorb more violence, but you're not allowed to exercise any violence whatsoever, right? Like any degree of violence from Black and brown bodies is excessive violence, right? And yes, the history and the current practice of policing is about controlling any degree of violence, right? Any degree of resistance, to use that word. And that's why I think police treat these white people protesting, we're going to treat y'all like Black and brown people now, Nakia said, right? Because in a sense, they are positioning themselves, right? I mean, Black and brown people are, for state power and for the police, right, inherently unruly, inherently, right, sort of needing to be controlled. And so if white people act in unruly ways and need to be controlled, then they're sort of turning themselves into this other kind of people. And of course, we can treat them that way. Of course, that's not the way it works out, right? Like, if I show up at a protest and police do violent things to me and haul me off, my outcomes are going to be way better, right, at the end of that whole process, right, than some other people's outcomes there, right? But I really think it's important to highlight that a lot of this really is about violence, and that violence has this sort of bad name. We're never supposed to have any of it. And I don't see the foundation for that way of thinking. I think resistance is inherently violent, even when it's nonviolent. It is inherently aimed at disrupting and deconstructing the systems of power, and needs to be, and that's necessary, right?
Thank you for all of that. While you were talking, I was trying. So this is a Kehinde Wiley painting, y'all. And there's I was trying to find another Kehinde Wiley painting that every time I see it, it takes my breath away. And it's a riff off of, oh, I forgot, like what is it called? It's a riff off of like a biblical picture where there's a woman who goes into this camp and cuts off the head of a king or like a ruler, and she's got this head that she's holding on to, and you can't see my hand gestures because I've got this thing in the way. He did the painting where it was this elegant, beautiful picture, statuesque, like Black woman in this like gorgeous gown, who has cut the head off of a white woman whose head she's holding, right? Like she's holding this head. And every time I see it, it takes my breath away, every single time. And I'm a little bit fascinated with this painting because I'm like, this is creating such a response, right? But like, we see pictures of dead Black people all the time, right? Like there's pictures of people who are hanging like made as postcards, right? Like there's been so much inuring of like Black bodies in harm or in states of pain or in states of death, right? Like they left oh my gosh, there's too many names, I can't even remember his name. They left him out on the street for 4 hours, right? Michael Brown, thank you. Also like the fact that there's too many names and I can't remember, also a source of trauma. That is trauma. But like they will show our dead bodies all of the time, but like me seeing this image was like, oh, but that's sacrosanct, right? Like there's something different, like there's a body quickening, like there's something that is happening bodily to me that I'm like, that's not okay. That's inhuman some type of way, right? And like, this is me as a Black person who has had like all of this training and like what is an anti-Blackness, and being able to understand what anti-racism is and how it applies, and living this anti-racist life. And even with like all of those things, understanding this process, like bodily, like my body still knows all of these messages that like this world has been telling me about like who is sacrosanct and who gets to have humanity, right? And so like I just really wanted to underscore your point, but I can't get the background to change. But I just really I feel like it's so clear. I feel like you're just so right about this idea that like there's just a kind of baseline that like Black bodies are here to be harmed, and that's okay, that we all have internalized on some level. And how does that change the way in which we perceive things, even as folks who are Black themselves, right? Oh, somebody thinks that they found the
looks like it.
Mm.
So I just want to really quickly, I just want to emphasize and connect that to why we're not going to be able to fix policing by trying to just fix policing. Because police will see the world, live in the world, and act in the world the way the larger society collectively sees and lives and acts, and we can't expect them to do differently. So it may make you a little more hopeless, but it really isn't about finding some good cops. It's about living together with each other differently enough that we retrain our bodies and we retrain our perceptions. And then we won't have to, probably we won't have to have the same kind of police at all, right? I mean, we won't have to have police that are out there to control and segregate, right? But we may not have to have as many police just trying to intervene in these crisis situations either, because many of these crisis situations are created by the kind of absorption into our bodies of these larger ways of seeing the world that Nakia was just talking about.
I want to just add another layer. And I know, I mean, I think my heart and my experiences with gender, but I did want to just flag that I don't know if anybody has read On Tyranny by any chance, but it lays out kind of what tyranny looks like and these signs and what to do. And there's a section on militarized police and just the use of the government in basically monopolizing violence and using police to do so. And so, you know, this disappearing protesters and, you know, people suddenly that don't like the government liking police, and kind of some of these signs of just a really putting the power into violence and policing is such a it's such a bad sign of for democracy, right? So not only is it bad for communities of color generally, and has been and is a part of the history of controlling people of color, but I think we should be thinking about it also as this harm to our democracy and the way that we give power to our government. So anyway, that was just a thought.
No, that was the brilliant, and I want to jump in right there because I think you hit the nail on the head when you said the monopoly over violence. It's really about reinforcing the idea that there's this one group of people who get to control violence in society and administer how and where and when that violence can happen more than anything else. And I think it's really interesting, you know, going back to Tayo's comments and some of what Phil said and what you're saying now about tyranny, I constantly remember this piece in Fanon where he talks about the moment the colonized person, he's talking about the war in Algeria for independence. He talks about the moment the colonized person sees the colonizer bleed and how that moment radically changes his perception of the world. The first time the colonized person sees the colonizer bleeding, he realizes, oh, the colonizer is just human. It's just like me. And he's not some kind of God. He's not some kind of greater being who's higher up above. And so it has this like healthy effect. That moment of violence, it has this effect where it allows the colonized person to regain some of their self-esteem. So I'm not here on AJC's Live advocating for violence, but I'm saying that we shouldn't have this like hypocritical or misleading idea about violence where, you know, where we don't recognize that there's this other side to violence, right? Like the painting from Kahindi, right? It's what happens when the person who's in that kind of subaltern position, who's in that position, takes action against their oppressor, and the transformative potential of that kind of violence is a very different thing. and so much so that that kind of violence doesn't even need to look like what we think of as violence regularly. That kind of violence can be like the most non-violent act or protest can be construed as violence, because if it threatens that state of things, then it already becomes a kind of a violence. So yeah, I just wanted to jump in there and add those 2 cents.
I think that that's like really inherent in the way that police operate too, right? Like the idea is that like you don't ever show weakness. You come in and you control the situation. And like that's why it's not about de-escalating. It's about like making sure that you understand that I'm in control of the situation, right? Like that I don't ever bleed, right? And I feel like it also reinforces this idea of like distancing and like not like I'm not human, right? Like the idea is like you're showing up and you're like I'm not human. And like that means that there's on some level that I'm completely untouchable. And it's a show of force and power in that same way that you're talking about, because when you find out that like Portland, you can just actually fight back and get like feds out of your place, and I think that that's also part of like why the response to Minneapolis, which I haven't heard any news out of Minneapolis for like a month. And I feel like that's on purpose, right? The idea is that like you've defunded the police, you've done this thing, it's possible, like, right? We couldn't even have a conversation about this for years, but now you have done the thing of defunding the police, and like there's nothing that can happen here besides like overwhelming force showing you why you're incorrect, right? And I feel like that's why we have that response that's so strong. Because otherwise, like we've seen the colonizer bleed, right? And like what is possible now that we have seen that, and what will become, like what will we create?
Yeah, Gloria Anzaldúa calls that arabato, right? A kind of violence that disrupts and reorients, right? And that it's necessary. And just a point that I think people miss, connected to what you were saying, Nakia, that, we talk about the way that all these people get killed by police, and we talk about how, it was for selling, an unlicensed cigarette, or it was for, buying a drink at a grocery store and walking down the wrong streets, or jogging on the wrong streets, or whatever, right? I think what people miss is that the crime that these people committed that got them killed was failing to submit to police control. In incident after incident, if you'll watch them, the police, it escalates, and it escalates rapidly at the moment that the person involved refuses to submit. Just sort of, the police go to any length to get back that control, even if that length is shooting them and killing them, right? I'm going to get the control.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. Okay. We can't end on that note.
No, but I actually wanted to ask a question to Amanda, which is a little bit along the line of the question that I asked Tayo, which is, from your perspective and from all the work that you've done specifically with victims and stuff, and not wanting to in any way blame the victims for having to call the police, right? Recognizing how terrible that choice dynamic is. When you think about possible alternatives to policing, in terms of things that could better respond to that need or to that place, obviously I don't expect you to like sort of solve the problem right now, but like what comes to mind, or where do you think, what are your hunches in that sense?
I love this question so much. And I think, and I see some folks from the Searchlight group on this call as well, that I'm really hopeful about transformative justice and really investing in options for accountability, because I think we're not going to end violence without that honesty and truth and accountability for harm, right? And being able to name it. And I think, transformative justice as opposed to like restorative justice, just this understanding that we really have we really have a lot of work to do to build our ability in community. I would say I've always worked for community-based advocacy groups and, with nonprofits, and, I've worked with survivors that, this happened to me, but I need healing from my mom not believing me and my pastor not believing me, or my job not doing anything. And so to the extent that we can actually hold trauma in our communities, we can really turn away from the police, right? Like, I think that right now when we look at police, they're free, right? Like, I don't have to pay anything to get that help, unlike a lot of the options survivors have now. So, I'm very hopeful for this kind of family business discussion about, like, how are we getting this wrong, right? Like, when so many people are dealing with the institutional betrayal of police, but also in their communities, right? There's so many stories, and I feel like Nakia probably has plenty, y'all probably have plenty of just, how we've been taught to hide and be quiet and silence ourselves. And I think if we don't get to a place where we're being honest and open and not silencing survivors, like how are we gonna end violence? So, and I think that's something I'm excited about, is as we explore options besides police, really putting some accountability and some ownership on communities to really develop their skills. Because it's not just about, okay, now I'm educating people, kind of like training, right? Like training cops is, but I would say that about anybody. Like, we can train people to understand consent and deconstruct rape culture, but if you don't have systems in place when people violate those boundaries, you're going to miss a lot of things, because it's not just about education. We're human and we mess up, and we need to be accountable. So, I think I'm excited about that. I'm less excited about what I think of as very shame-based accountability. I definitely don't think, I think a lot of people think, okay, if we don't use police, maybe we can do these things that, call out people or kind of force accountability through other methods. And I think that is not effective long-term. So how do we create accountability metrics or tools that aren't shaming? And there's a difference between like shaming and people feeling shame. I think sometimes we feel shame, but we're not being shamed. It's a whole thing. But I definitely think that it takes creativity to figure out how to hold ourselves accountable, because we need that when we harm people, how we heal from that. And I do think it starts with community, us getting our stuff together, really.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Can I say something that'll be better than that last thing I said? Maybe?
I mean, you were right. I was just saying
I think I'm right, but yeah, that was a bummer. I think my answer to your question, Joe, what does it look like to not have police, right? I've been thinking about that a lot too. And I have kind of two answers. No, they're connected, right? One of my standard answers to people is go into an affluent white neighborhood. You'll see what it's like not to be policed, right? Not to necessarily, police are there, but they're there keeping other people out of that neighborhood, right? And so part of the answer there is, when you're given the resources you need to live well, then you typically don't need that kind of force in your community. One of my other answers is look at the barriadas, right, of like Villa El Salvador in Lima, Peru, right? This is a place, this is a squatter's village that became a city within a city, right? That created its own systems of social systems, social structures, met the needs of its community members, and ensured their safety, right? And it did all of it without sort of state agencies or state institutions, right? And because I think the answer is the answer Amanda just gave, so I just want to amplify. We've got to learn to live in communities again. We've got to learn what it means to live in a community and have that community be there, take up the responsibility to meet those needs.
I think that I feel like that's so critical in being able to reimagine what policing is and reimagine what public safety is, right? Reimagining public safety means being able to know who your neighbors are and like speak to them and feel like you're safe in your neighborhood, right? Regardless of what neighborhood that happens to be. It also means like, I think that there's sometimes when people are like, who are we going to send in? You're going to send in somebody. We're going to send in social workers. And they can just like take over policing and they can be the kinder, gentler the policers, right? And I think that being able to go, okay, like if you're having a mental health crisis, not who can like control that, but like who can help you through this? And like talking about peer support specialists, right? And people who aren't coming at this power over, but people who are like, these are folks in your community who have had the same sort of like experience and can go, hey, this is what happened to me. Like, I know where you're at because I actually know where you're at, and not like a police officer who's like, I can help you. No, really, we can help you, right? And that's like kind of the best that you want to expect from police officers, right? Don't shoot me, like, can try to help me. But somebody who actually is experiencing something that's similar to what you're talking about, and also who knows how to navigate the systems, and knows what's been helpful for them, and like what are your community resources. Because when we talk about trauma, I want to say that the source of the protests are both a source of trauma and a source of resilience, right? Like I sprained my back right before like all of the protests happened in Austin, and my mental psyche was just absolutely shot, right? It was something where I'm like, okay, so they killed George Floyd and I can't move this through my body. Like I can't do a bunch of push-ups. I can't like fight a beanbag. I can't do anything because I'm laid up. But the thing that I really wanted to do was I wanted to be out in the streets with other people saying that this is not okay. Like I wanted to feel the power in numbers, right? Because that is what brings us life. That is what connects us back to humanity, is people standing up and saying like, no, this shit's not okay. And doing it in so much of a force that you're like, this can't be squashed, right? Like there are people who are out here who are fighting for folks that look like me. And part of the other part of being human is like being connected to your community, knowing that there's somebody out here who's like, hey, we've got you. Like, we're going to make sure that nothing happens to you because what happens to you happens to me. And like, we're all in this together, right? And so I think that being able to like have that community lens is the thing that we need to be able to use in order to get to the public safety that we really want to have, right? And that includes around like immigration, like fuck ICE, like not trying to deal with that, right? Like how are we in community with our undocumented communities, right? Like how are we there for those folks? And like how are we there for anybody who is queer, right? Anybody, like just being able to like understand that these are valued, these are identities that are valued because we're all human, and being able to have a lens that goes like community first. Like this is what we're trying to do here, is to be able to create a cohesive group of folks that can live together and value each other and be in safety. Whew, you're on mute, JP.
I love that. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you all for participating. This was an awesome conversation. It was really wonderful. And I look forward to the next one. Every Wednesday, we will continue doing this.
Not next Wednesday.
No, not next Wednesday. Sorry. Next Wednesday will be AJC's. We're having a giant, originally it was called the Defund APD Block Party. Now we're calling it the Budget Block Party. But it's a giant block party at the Palmer Event Center. Sorry. We'll be watching the City Council's vote live, following the results of the vote, and we will be out all day, social distancing, wearing masks, but there will be food for everyone. There will be live music, and we're going to celebrate this important step towards turning Austin into a whole different thing. So next Wednesday, meet us in person at the Palmer Event Center. And the Wednesday after that, we will be joining y'all again here for more of this awesome talk. At the event center on Wednesday, we will be all day. We're going to be out there all day from the morning. We're going to have breakfast, and then we're going to just hang out until we watch the vote, the results to the vote come in. So come hang out with us, spend a day in community if you can. If you can't, join us whenever you can.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our participants for joining and engaging with us. And thank you for sticking it out. And thank y'all for your time. This was really great. We appreciate y'all.
Thank y'all.
Bye.